He raised his glass and smiled like a man who had never once paid for anything he broke. 200 people in a lakeside ballroom, peonies and candlelight, and a string quartet playing something soft and expensive. My sister, the girl I raised on second-hand furniture and cold determination, was standing 20 feet away in the most beautiful dress I had ever seen, and the man at the microphone was using her wedding toast to remind the room that she had never had a real family, that I had never been enough, that the stability she'd finally found was something I could never have given her. I couldn't believe it. And yet, I had been waiting for exactly this moment. Here's what nobody in that room knew. The man humiliating me in front of everyone wasn't just a wealthy, arrogant father-in-law with poor social judgment. He was the man I believed had buried the truth about my parents' deaths for 20 years. He was the man whose signature sat on a safety report that should have saved 11 lives, and didn't. He was the reason I raised my sister alone at 17, working double shifts and carrying a secret so heavy it had reshaped the architecture of my entire life. The shocking part wasn't his toast. The shocking part was that he had no idea what was already in motion. I had been lied to by official reports. My family had been cheated out of justice by a system his money had quietly influenced. I had been shamed, quietly and consistently, by the world's assumption that 2 orphaned girls from a small Nevada town would simply absorb their loss and disappear. But here's the thing about truth. The real, documented, federally subpoenaed kind. It doesn't disappear. It waits. And I had given it 20 years to gather itself. What happened next changed everything. Not just for me. Not just for my sister. For every family who had ever been told that what happened to them was no one's fault. This is the story of how I raised my sister from nothing, carried the truth about the man who destroyed our family, and waited, patiently, precisely, with everything on the line, for the exact right moment to let it breathe. The ballroom in Lake Tahoe was breathtaking. White orchids, crystal chandeliers, 200 people dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine. My sister Priya had always dreamed of a wedding like this, and watching her glow at the altar made every sacrifice feel worth it. I smiled. I told myself this was her day. I told myself I could handle anything. Then Gerald Weston stood up. He was the kind of man who wore power like cologne, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. He tapped his glass, cleared his throat, and the entire room went quiet the way rooms do when money speaks. He looked at Priya, smiled, and said she'd finally found a real family. I felt the air shift before the words even landed fully. A stable home, he said, is something her sister could never give her. I couldn't believe it. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was polite, the kind that's almost worse, the kind that says we agree but won't admit it. I felt humiliated in a way that goes deeper than embarrassment. It lands somewhere near your spine and stays there. My face stayed still. My hands did not shake. But inside, something ancient woke up. What Gerald Weston didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had been waiting for a moment exactly like this. Not with rage, not with chaos, with something far more dangerous. The truth. And the truth, when you've carried it for 20 years, doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. It just needs the right moment. I raised my glass back at him, smiled the way you smile when you already know the ending, and I thought, enjoy this, Gerald. Enjoy every single second of it. I was 11 years old when the ground swallowed my parents whole. The Keller Ridge mine in rural Nevada collapsed on a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of morning with blue skies and cold air, the kind that makes you think nothing bad can happen. My father, Dominic Delvin, had worked that mine for 9 years. My mother, Sina, drove him every single day. That Tuesday, she decided to wait for him inside. Neither of them came home. The official report said it was a natural seismic event. Ground shifting, pressure buildup, nothing anyone could have predicted or prevented. The community mourned, the company sent flowers, and Gerald Weston, the owner of Weston Ridge Resources, gave a very moving speech about the tragedy of nature. I was a child. I believed it. For a while. But backstabbed by grief, I became obsessed with understanding what had happened. For 6 years, we moved through relatives, temporary guardianships, and a system that never quite knew what to do with 2 girls who refused to be separated. By the time I was 19, I was studying civil engineering, and I started pulling archived reports, safety inspections, and internal memos, not because I had a plan, but because something in the numbers never felt right. And then one night, in a university library in Reno at 2 a.m, I found it. A structural assessment dated 8 months before the collapse, flagged by an independent contractor, warning of critical ventilation failures and compromised load-bearing support columns. The report had been buried, signed off, and the signature on the approval form? Gerald Weston. The betrayal I felt wasn't just grief. It was the sickening realization that their deaths weren't an accident. They were a consequence of greed, of shortcuts, of a man who chose profit over the lives of people who trusted him. I sat in that library and I shook, not from sadness, from the weight of knowing something that changes everything, and not yet knowing what to do with it. I closed the folder. I went home. I looked at Priya, who was 8 and asleep on our second-hand sofa, and I made a promise to 2 people who couldn't hear me anymore. I was 17 when I became Priya's mother. Not legally. The system tried to split us up, send her to one foster family, me to another. I remember sitting in that social worker's office and telling her, with a calm I didn't actually feel, that if they separated us, I would fight it every step of the way. I don't know if it was my certainty or my exhaustion, but something worked. We stayed together. We stayed together in a 1-bedroom apartment I paid for with 2 part-time jobs and a scholarship I nearly lost twice. I did her homework with her at the kitchen table while I studied structural load calculations. I packed her lunch while memorizing the properties of reinforced concrete. I went to her school plays, her science fairs, her first heartbreak, and every night after she fell asleep, I went back to the files. The mine reports, the financial records, the names. I wasn't looking for vengeance then. I was looking for understanding. But understanding, when it's dark enough, starts to look a lot like justice. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the silence. I couldn't tell Priya what I knew. She was a child, then a teenager, then a young woman, and she deserved to build her life without the weight of what I was carrying. So I carried it alone. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment she laughed and was happy. I smiled and kept the secret locked somewhere behind my ribs where she couldn't see it. My self-worth back then wasn't something anyone celebrated. I wasn't the sister who had it together. I was the one who worked double shifts, who wore the same 2 pairs of shoes for 3 years, who said no to everything that cost money so Priya could say yes to anything that mattered. And I would do it all again without a second thought. But I want to be honest. It cost me. It cost me in ways I'm still counting. What I didn't know then was that the universe has its own sense of karma, and that the same man who buried the truth about my parents was quietly weaving himself into the future I had sacrificed everything to protect. When Priya called me to say she'd met someone, her voice had that particular lightness I'd spent 15 years trying to give her. His name was Callum Weston. He was charming, educated, generous, the kind of man who opens doors and remembers your coffee order and makes you feel like the most important person in the room. I liked him, actually. That's the part that still stings. I liked him before I knew who his father was. And when I found out, when she said the name Weston over the phone, I went completely still in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with dread. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. It wasn't just shock. It was the specific horror of watching 2 separate timelines collide. The girl I raised, the joy I worked for, the future I bled for, crashing headfirst into the secret I'd protected her from for 2 decades. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I stayed there for a long time. I thought about saying something immediately. I thought about breaking everything right then and there, but I didn't. Because Priya was in love. Genuinely, deeply, completely in love. And I had learned, from years of engineering, of all things, that you don't dismantle a structure while people are still standing inside it. You survey first. You document. You build the case with facts so undeniable that no one can look away. The infidelity here wasn't romantic. It was structural. A man had cheated his way through safety protocols and lied to an entire community, and my sister was about to marry into his bloodline. The engagement party was held at the Weston estate in Lake Tahoe. 40 rooms, a private dock, staff in matching uniforms. Gerald shook my hand at the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at me the way powerful men look at people they've decided don't matter. I shook his hand back. I smiled, and I thought, you have no idea who you just let into your home. That night, I went back to my files. I hadn't opened those files in almost a decade. It was time. I've always believed that the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits. Over the next 18 months, I became someone I barely recognized in the mirror. By day, I was Karen Delvin, senior structural engineer at a firm in Sacramento. By night, I was something closer to a detective, cross-referencing mine inspection records, tracking financial transfers, building a timeline that connected Gerald Weston's decisions to the day that mine came down. It wasn't revenge yet. It was archaeology. I was digging up what had been buried. The first layer was the engineering fraud. I found 3 separate assessments, each one flagging structural instability at Keller Ridge, that had been altered before being submitted to the Nevada Mining Authority. 2 of the original contractors had been paid off. One had tried to go public and been silenced with a lawsuit that bankrupted him within a year. The paper trail was old and deliberately messy, but for someone who spent her career reading structural documents, it read like a confession. The second layer was the money. I connected with a journalist named Silas Okafor, who had been independently investigating Weston Ridge Resources for an unrelated environmental case. Silas was the one who knew how to follow the money. When I showed him what I had, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Karen, this is bigger than the mine." He was right. There were offshore accounts, regulatory payments routed through shell companies, environmental violations across 3 states, all tied back to Gerald. The financial fraud alone was enough to bury him. I felt something during this time that I can only describe as a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking. I was focused. The way you get focused when the thing you've been circling for 20 years finally comes into view. The shocking part wasn't finding the evidence. The shocking part was how clean it was once you knew where to look. Gerald Weston had been careful, but not careful enough. The trap was taking shape, and every piece I found was another plank in the floor beneath his feet, a floor he didn't know was rotting. There is a version of justice that feels clean in theory and devastating in practice. 3 weeks before the wedding, I sat across from Silas at a diner in Carson City with every piece of evidence laid out between our coffee cups, and I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. Because it wasn't just Gerald I would be exposing. It was Callum's name. It was Priya's wedding day. It was the future she had built on top of a foundation she didn't know was poisoned. The dilemma wasn't whether Gerald deserved what was coming. He did, completely and without question. The dilemma was whether the truth had the right to arrive on her wedding day. I thought about this for weeks. I didn't sleep much. I walked around my apartment at 3 a.m, asking myself questions I couldn't answer easily. Was I doing this for justice? For my parents? For the families of the 11 other workers who died in that collapse and never saw a single dollar of accountability? Or was I doing it for the little girl I used to be, standing in a social worker's office, refusing to let the world take anything else from her? The honest answer was, all of it. And I had to make peace with that. What finally settled it for me wasn't logic. It was a photograph. I keep one photo on my desk. My parents, laughing outside the mine on their last morning. My mother's hair is blowing sideways in the wind. My father has his arm around her. They're both squinting into the sun. I looked at that photograph and I thought about dignity, about their dignity, buried under a false report for 20 years. And I knew I couldn't walk into that wedding and watch Gerald Weston give a toast as though none of it ever happened. But I also knew that if I did this carelessly, I would lose Priya. And losing Priya was something I could not survive. So I made a decision that was neither cold nor reckless. I would expose him completely, with evidence so airtight, so public, so undeniably documented that not even grief could allow denial. I would give Priya something she didn't know she needed, the truth with nowhere left to hide. The wedding was 21 days away. I had work to do. The week before the wedding, everything clicked into place with a precision that felt almost cinematic. Silas had quietly been working with federal investigators for months before the wedding, carefully, without tipping anything to anyone connected to Weston. The evidence package we had assembled was, by any standard, extraordinary. Original engineering reports with Gerald's sign-off, financial records showing the payoffs, statements from 2 of the surviving contractors who had been silenced, environmental violation citations tied to his offshore accounts, and a recorded conversation, legally obtained, in which one of Gerald's former associates referenced the Keller Ridge decision in terms that left nothing open to interpretation. We weren't building a story. We were building a case. What made the plan elegant, and I say this as an engineer who respects elegant solutions, was the timing. Gerald Weston was a man who loved an audience. He had already confirmed he would give the wedding toast. The ballroom at the Lake Tahoe resort had a digital presentation system that the event coordinator, a quiet, meticulous woman named Dara, who owed Silas a favor, had agreed to hand over access to at a specific time. Not dramatically, not obviously, just available. I want to be honest about something. I struggled with the public nature of it. Part of me wanted to do this in a courtroom, in proper channels, without the theater. But Gerald Weston had spent 20 years hiding behind private settlements and powerful lawyers. Public truth was the one place he had no protection. The wedding was the one moment he would be standing in a room with no armor on, performing generosity, surrounded by cameras and witnesses. Justice, I decided, deserved the same audience he'd used to humiliate me. On the night before the ceremony, I sat alone in my hotel room in Lake Tahoe, and I thought about karma, about how it never quite works the way you expect it to, but when it arrives with a completeness that takes your breath away. I thought about the mine, about the Tuesday morning with the blue sky, about my mother's hair blowing sideways in the wind. I set my alarm. I pressed my dress. And I was ready. It was the most beautiful wedding I had ever attended. Priya was radiant. Callum cried at the altar. Real tears, the kind you can't manufacture. The flowers were peonies and eucalyptus. The music was live strings. And for about 3 hours I allowed myself to just be her sister. Just that. Not an investigator, not a witness, not the woman carrying 20 years of buried truth in her chest. Just Karen, just proud, just grateful she had made it this far. And then Gerald Weston stood up. He was smooth, of course. That's the thing about men like him. They are extraordinarily good at performance. He thanked the guests, praised his son, said something charming about Priya's beauty. And then he turned, just slightly, and he made a remark about family, about what real family means, about stability, about what my sister had finally found. The room smiled. I heard a few soft laughs. I felt once again shamed in the most elegant way possible, quietly, with a smile, in a room full of witnesses. I looked down at my phone. There was one message from Silas. 3 words. It's going live. What happened next is something I have replayed in my mind 100 times since. The ballroom screens, which had been showing a soft wedding slideshow, shifted. The room didn't understand what it was seeing yet, but I did. First, a headline from the Nevada Mining Authority. Then, financial records. Then, a photograph of the original Keller Ridge safety report with Gerald's signature circled in red. The sound in the room changed, not loud, not immediately, but like the moment before a wave hits, when everything gets very, very quiet. Gerald turned. He saw the screens. And for the first time in the 20 years I had been watching this man from a distance, I saw something on his face that looked exactly like fear. He tried to speak. The words didn't come. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling narratives, controlling rooms, controlling people. The silence that overtook Gerald Weston in that ballroom was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Two federal agents who had been stationed discreetly near the venue entrance moved through the crowd with a quiet efficiency that suggested this had been coordinated well before the champagne was poured. And it had. Every detail, every second. The arrest warrant had been signed 2 days prior. The charges read later like a catalog of every shortcut a powerful man could take. Criminal negligence resulting in death, falsification of safety documentation, bribery of regulatory officials, financial fraud across 3 states, and environmental violations tied to illegal dumping from his Nevada operations going back 16 years. The Keller Ridge collapse, officially reclassified from a natural seismic event to a preventable industrial failure, was now at the center of a federal investigation that would take over a year to fully untangle. But the beginning was public. Unmistakably, irreversibly public. I watched him walk out of that ballroom between 2 agents, his tuxedo jacket still on, his boutonniere still pinned to his lapel. The vengeance I had imagined over 20 years had always felt large and cinematic in my mind. But the reality was quieter than that. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've carried so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. The payback wasn't the image of him in handcuffs. The payback was the truth, finally, in open air. The press was outside the venue within the hour. By morning, the name Weston Ridge Resources was trending nationally, not as a mining empire, but as a case study in corporate corruption and the families it had left behind. 11 workers, 11 names, my parents among them. For the first time in 20 years, their deaths were being reported not as a tragedy of nature, but as a consequence of greed. The truth had finally arrived at the address it was always meant for. But in that hotel ballroom, as the guests stood in stunned silence and the music stopped, and Priya's face crumpled into something I had never seen before, I knew the hardest part of the day was only just beginning. She didn't speak to me for 6 weeks. I understood it. I want to be clear about that. I understood Priya's anger in a way that went beyond empathy, because I had chosen this. I had chosen the day, the method, the audience. I had made a calculation that justice was more important than the wedding she had dreamed of since she was 8 years old, and no matter how right that calculation was, she had every right to feel betrayed by it. The irony of that word, betrayal, was not lost on me. Family betrayal cuts in every direction at once. She called me eventually on a Thursday night. She didn't say hello. She said, "I need to know if you knew before the engagement." I told her yes. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Longer than the night our parents didn't come home. Longer than the night in the library when I found the report. When she finally spoke, her voice was very flat, very controlled, and she said, "You let me fall in love with his son." And I said, "Yes, because Callum isn't his father." That was the beginning, not the resolution, the beginning. Grief doesn't resolve in a single conversation. She had to mourn the wedding, mourn the version of her father-in-law she had believed in, mourn the fairy tale that had been interrupted by the truth. And I had to sit with the knowledge that protecting her from pain for 20 years had not, in the end, protected her from pain. It had only deferred it. I had lied by omission for her whole life, and now she had to decide what to do with that. What made it survivable, for both of us, was Callum. He handled the collapse of his father's legacy with a dignity that I genuinely did not expect. And in doing so, he gave Priya something to hold on to. He didn't defend Gerald. He didn't attack me. He sat with his wife in their apartment in San Francisco and said, "I want to know everything." That openness, that willingness to let the truth reconfigure everything he'd believed. I respected it more than I can say. The fracture was real. But fractures, in engineering and in families, are not the same as breaks. They are the places where, if tended to carefully, something new can grow. The federal investigation took 14 months from first charge to sentencing. Gerald Weston was convicted on 9 counts, including criminal negligence and financial fraud. He was sentenced to 11 years, one, people noted, for each worker who had died in the Keller Ridge collapse. His legal team had argued for leniency. The presiding judge disagreed, citing what she called a decades-long pattern of calculated indifference to human life. I was in the courtroom. When the sentence was read, I didn't cheer. I just breathed. Weston Ridge Resources was dismantled and restructured under federal oversight, with a court-appointed board that included 2 of the surviving victim families and an independent safety council. The new entity, renamed Keller Foundation Resources, was legally required to fund ongoing environmental remediation and to contribute annually to a victim compensation trust. It was, in the language of law, a settlement. In the language of my life, it was something closer to a reckoning. The company that had profited from the deaths of 11 people was now, by court order, working to repair what it had broken. The compensation trust reached out to surviving families within months of sentencing. I want to be honest. Money doesn't fix what was taken. It doesn't give Priya her parents back. It doesn't replace the years I spent working double shifts so we could survive. But there is something in being officially recognized, in having a federal court state, clearly and on record, that what happened to our family was not an act of God, but an act of negligence, that does something to the part of you that spent years being told the opposite. My self-worth, my dignity as their daughter, felt finally, formally restored. I drove out to Nevada during that period, alone, to see the site for the first time as an adult. The entrance to the old mine had been sealed for years, overgrown with scrub brush and chain-link fencing, and a small, faded sign with 11 names on it. I stood there for a long time. I thought about my father's laugh. I thought about my mother waiting for him inside. Reclaiming their story had cost me almost everything, but standing there, I knew it had been the only thing to do. A year after the trial, the Keller Ridge site was formally dedicated as a memorial sanctuary. The state of Nevada, in partnership with the Keller Foundation, converted the land into a preserved natural space. Walking paths through high desert, drought-resistant wildflowers, and at the center, a curved stone wall bearing the names of all 11 workers. There was a small ceremony, surviving families, journalists, local officials, and a handful of people I'd never met who had been following the case from the beginning. Priya stood beside me the entire time, her hand in mine. Her daughter, 3 months old, wrapped against her chest, sleeping through the whole thing. She had named her Karen. I found out at the hospital when Priya called from the delivery room. She said, "I named her after the person who chose truth when it would have been so much easier not to." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said I was honored. And I was. Completely, quietly, completely honored. Not because of the gesture, though it meant more than I'll ever be able to articulate, but because of what it signaled. That she understood now why I had done what I did. That the silence I'd carried and the choice I'd made had not destroyed us. It had, eventually, made us more honest with each other than we had ever been. Karma, I've come to understand, doesn't look like what you imagine when you're in the dark. It doesn't look like fire or collapse or dramatic reversal. It looks like a stone wall in the Nevada desert with your parents' names carved into it. It looks like your sister, who once blamed you for the hardest day of her life, standing beside you in the wind and not letting go of your hand. It looks like a baby named after the woman who carried the truth when no one else could. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet reclaiming of a story that was stolen from you. The slow, methodical, decade-long insistence that the truth matters, that the people who were lost mattered, that dignity is not something anyone can permanently take from you, no matter how powerful they are or how high they raise their glass. The ground beneath his feet cracked, and underneath it, finally, after 20 years, there was something solid. And that, right there, is the part that still takes my breath away. Not the arrest, not the headline, not the courtroom. It's the image of Priya holding my hand in the Nevada wind, her daughter named after me asleep against her chest, standing in front of a wall that finally said the truth out loud. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it. Have you ever carried a truth that you knew could break everything, and had to decide, alone, whether the breaking was worth it? Have you ever been humiliated in a room full of people and smiled because you knew something they didn't? Have you ever loved someone so much that you protected them from a truth that was also yours to tell? Because that's what this story is really about. Not just vengeance, though let's be honest, the karma in that ballroom was deeply satisfying. Not just justice, though 11 families deserved every word of that verdict. It's about what it costs to be the person who refuses to let the truth stay buried. It's about self-worth, the kind you build in silence, over years, while the world underestimates you. It's about dignity. Not the kind that's given to you in a toast, but the kind you reclaim, piece by piece, from everything that tried to take it. So tell me, drop it in the comments right now. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between protecting someone you love and telling them the truth? What did you do? What did it cost you? And if you had to do it over, would you? I genuinely want to know. Because the most powerful thing about stories like this one isn't the fall of the villain. It's recognizing yourself somewhere in it. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think about justice, about family betrayal, about what it really means to reclaim your story, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Because what's coming next goes even deeper. Into the stories we carry, the truths we protect, and the moments that define who we are when everything is on the line. The truth always finds its moment. Make sure you're here when it does.